Welcome back to the Bible in Context, where we continue the conversation with Aaron Sherwood this week in our third segment of our interview with him, where we talk about the mixed multitude motif running throughout Scripture and what that means for biblical theology by the time we get to Paul. So this is going to be a really great interview. We're going to talk about how this might interact with the Exodus motif from our study through Genesis, and just explore what implications we can draw from Aaron's doctoral thesis on this topic. So it's going to be a really great interview. Thanks for sticking around, and I hope that these three interviews with Aaron have been a real blessing to your understanding of Romans, and then hopefully of the importance of the Gentile inclusions in the Israelite salvation in Paul's mind. All right. I appreciate you letting me talk your ear off just a little bit more.
Sure.
And so the reason for this question, which I've mentioned to you outside of the podcast, is I've written some work on the Exodus motif through Genesis, and it seems to me that the Exodus motif shows up about 20-ish times before the actual exodus of Israel out of Egypt. And a big part of that is the mixed multitude element of that. And you've written a couple of things. One was your doctoral dissertation, which you had published into a book. So I've actually read your article first. The name of your article is The Mixed Multitude in Exodus 12:38, Glorification, Creation, and Yahweh's Plunder of Israel and the Nations. And then you also have your published dissertation under the title of Paul and the Restoration of Humanity in the Light of Ancient Jewish Traditions. So both of them a mouthful, which means they're probably good books.
Right.
And so you mentioned in an email just that it seems like the mixed multitude motif is in Exodus, it's kind of just mentioned without much fanfare, which means it's so deeply ingrained into these other places that you pick it up. And so sadly, I haven't gotten to read Paul and the Restoration of Humanity yet, but give us just a brief overview of how you see that element of the Exodus motif playing into the rest of Scripture, because I'm just curious where this goes, since it seems like to me the author of Genesis often has the idea of the elect one coming out of an Exodus with, more family, more servants, camels, donkeys, big herds, silver and gold, a mixture of those elements. And just to give kind of a brief sum up for some context, we see that, for example, with Abram and Sarai coming out of Egypt in Genesis 12. We see that again, actually Noah, we see that as he comes off the ark with his family and the animals. We see it again in some other sister fib stories with Rebecca coming out from Abimelech, Sarah coming out from Abimelech. We see Dinah coming out from Shechem. We see Jacob coming out from Laban, and they've all got these mixed multitudes and great riches with them. And it seems like that's preparing us for the paradigmatic Exodus in Exodus 12 to 14, in that range. So, I'd be curious to see if you concurred with what's in Genesis, but aside from that, since we haven't really dug into that, how do you see this going forward in the Bible, this mixed multitude motif? Where does it show up, and how does it factor into biblical theology?
Right. I do see it some in Genesis. I agree with I was able to peruse your so generously loaned manuscript to me. Thank you. And I see those parallels that you're talking about of Exodus stuff in the family history saga of Genesis. And I used to have a chicken and the egg friendly debate with one of my profs about what comes first, creation or Exodus, right? We mostly talked about the Exodus narrative and Genesis 1 and 2 stuff. And I think that we mostly agreed that the Exodus is paradigmatic, as you put it, because it is the primary kind of like anchoring experience in Israel's history, which, side note, the thing that sets Judeo-Christianity off from every other world religion is that it's historical. Other world religions, Hinduism and Buddhism and Shintoism and Islam and these other things, they are sort of position statements with abstract theology and concepts. The Judeo-Christian heritage uniquely says, no, this thing really happened. And we had to try and figure out what happened and what it meant, but it really happened. And what happened was significant because of what it was that was happening. And so that's a whole separate topic that I really like waxing theological on sometimes. But
Yeah, you've raised some questions, but I'll
Yeah,
let you keep going.
it's a good idea to think about, and then you can start thinking about questions. Talks, that's how I talk about what Paul says about the Spirit in his letters when he talks about the reality of the Spirit, not the concept or the theological principle of Trinitarianism, but the reality of the Spirit to people he's trying to persuade of this or that in his letters. So, anyway, off the digression. In history, the Exodus was the defining experience of the religio-ethnic nation of Israel. And therefore, I think they use Exodus as a template for doing all sorts of theology. I do think that the theology of who God is, what creation is, what humanity is, those axioms that you get in Genesis 1 and 2 are theologically primary. I think Exodus is theologically secondary, but I think it's experientially and explanatorily primary, if that makes sense. So I think the biblical author, I think Moses explains theology in terms of the Exodus, but theology is theology. But the Exodus is the template that always gets used. And so when we come into the mixed multitude, that's one instance in Exodus 12 of not Israel joining with Hebrews or Israelites to be God's people. And we can come back to this if you want to. I'll just really quickly sort of do a Cliff Notes summary of my PhD work. There are not a lot of times in Jewish tradition, biblical or extra biblical, there's not a lot of times that this idea of Jews and not Jews joining together to be God's people comes up. But it happens a dozen times. And every time it does happen, it follows the same paradigm, or that's the wrong word. It follows, I use the word constellation. It uses the same features each time. And it always is brought out as the big gun when an author needs to make a big gun point. It's sort of
Really?
it's sort of the theological principle of last resort. That's why it comes up so seldomly, I would say. So my PhD work is showing that it comes up this one time in Exodus, and this shared time in Micah and Isaiah, and this other time in Isaiah, and this time over here in First Kings, and this time in actually kind of a bunch of times in the Psalter, but I just picked kind of one chunk of time where it happens in the Psalter. And then in the competing versions of Judaism between 400 BC and 200 AD, in those different schools of thought, it pops up another 5 or so, 6 times. And all those competing versions of Judaism don't agree on what the people of God necessarily will end up being or what God is going to do next in history, but they all agree on this theological principle. And then that's my context in my PhD work for looking at what Paul's doing. One of the prompts for me to do that work was oftentimes you'll see Pauline scholars say, Paul's doctrine of salvation is the most important. Paul loves justification by faith. And the idea of being justified by faith leads him to realize that faith is open to Jews and non-Jews alike. And I think that's putting it exactly backwards. I think that's the cart before the horse. I think that Paul is Jewish, just like all those other examples I just gave. And Paul is starting with the big picture idea that God's trying to get all of humanity back being the people of God as much as he can. That's the fundamental goal. And Jesus is starting to do that, Paul being a Jesus-following Jewish person. And then Paul goes off for a decade or more and starts to figure out how is God going to do that. And that's where he starts to realize the doctrine of justification by faith. That's how God's going to do it. So that's my PhD work. So if there's a whole bunch of, not tons and tons and tons, but a whole bunch of big gun moments in Scripture and even outside of Scripture that Jews kind of standardly say, yeah, God's big picture plan is to rehumanize humanity using the people of Israel to get as many people into the people of God as possible. That's why it's unremarked upon when you see that happening as one of those moments in Exodus 12. When the sons of Israel, when the Hebrews finally successfully come out of Egypt near the end of the Exodus cycle of chapters 3 to 14, they bring with them, like you said, stuff that gets foreshadowed and echoed even in Genesis. They bring with them the plunder of gold and treasures, and they bring costly garments and much livestock, and also a mixed multitude. Well, the author doesn't need to stop. The narrator doesn't need to stop and say, now let me explain to you what a rich garment looks like. He doesn't need to stop and say, now let me tell you about cattle. Because you'd go, duh, I know what cattle are. And if you're a good scriptural student, if you're a good biblical theology student who knows the axioms of theology according to the scriptural tradition, then when the mixed multitude gets mentioned, you also don't need to stop and explain that because, duh, we all know that that's God's endgame. So the mixed multitude is sort of as mundane as garments and cattle in the sense that everybody already knows the referent of that. It doesn't need to be paused and explained.
So to sum up and try to make sure that I'm catching all this, what you're saying is that the mixed multitude element of does it break out of an Exodus context very often beyond the Exodus, or is it typically couched in an Exodus context?
Well, Exodus is, let me think. I'm thinking back through Isaiah 2, Micah 4, Isaiah 56, Psalms. The features that you consistently see are a creational element. And in about half of those, it's creation in terms of new Exodus, right?
That's part of the argument that I make sort of tangentially, is that looking at the links between creation and Exodus and then the way it's weaved throughout the rest of Genesis, they're inseparable ideas.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. I guess so. We're seeing when we see a mixed multitude, we're saying that this is God's big picture idea, and so when they just drop in this little detail of like there's a mixed multitude and great riches, it's a little highlighter saying that this is a very significant point of the text, or this is my point, the prophet's point in this pericope. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, it's very, very significant. It's very potent, but it's also almost to be expected. So it's unsurprising, but very potent. So you don't want to say significant in terms of, ooh, it's a highlighter. Look at this thing that you didn't see. It's more like oh yeah, check that box, the expected box that we should see checked. You can highlight it and say, yeah, that expected element is there as it should be.
Gotcha. So as just say the prophet is reaching a crescendo in his work, he puts that in there to make sure like you know that this essential element of God's future work is happening. This is all part of God's program. Okay, cool.
Yeah, there's a handful of places.
I understood the big guns reference.
Yeah, like there's a handful, like another place that you see not exactly this restoration of humanity thing happening explicitly, but you see it a little bit, and Paul picks up on it. There's a handful of places in Scripture, the Old Testament, where it's very easy to see, and there's a handful of places where it's there if you're looking for it, and Paul does, and he cites those places. So together you have a larger database because of Paul quoting some of the things that aren't the same things that I quote. And in one of those, there's this chunk of Psalms 113 through 118, which is known as the Egyptian Hallel. It is the chunk of Psalms that traditionally is, back as far as 70 AD at least. I don't know about Orthodox Judaism today, but back in ancient Judaism, that was the chunk of Psalms that was read as part of the Passover meal. So there you would see that there isn't the explicit Exodus stuff mentioned, but that's the traditional Exodus holiday psalm reading. So when Paul says, oh, look, here's a moment where Jews and non-Jews are joining together to be God's people, and it happens to be in the Exodus chunk of Psalms that we read every Passover. Or there's my memory is a bit fuzzy, but if I remember right, in Isaiah 56 to 66, there's a couple sprinkled elements that kind of crescendo at a certain moment, and at that certain moment, it's new creation being expressed as new Exodus, the Exodus out of exile that mirrors the Exodus out of Egypt that Israel's looking forward to, just as they remember it happening in the past. There's other places in that database that the Exodus element isn't there. It's just creation stuff. Talking about original creation, like in one of the passages I argue it happens in is in 1 Kings 8. that is a creation passage, not a Exodus passage. But you've argued that there's good reason to see an inextricable link between Exodus and creation. So you could say maybe it's there in the subtext. And then there's other places like Micah 4, where it's eschatological new creation, no Exodus stuff happening. But you could again argue that implicitly in the subtext, maybe there's an Exodus element or a new Exodus element because new creation and eschatological new creation is being mentioned. So
yeah, and there's some places where they're separated, and places where get Revelation, which combines them. But it's interesting to me, especially that you talk about outside of extra biblical texts, Second Temple Judaism texts that kind of still mention this element in like a standard way. As I've been going through some works on the reception of the Exodus motif throughout Second Temple Judaism, it's not standard. And it's used for a variety of purposes, which, there's, like you've said, many Judaisms versus maybe the however you want to phrase this, the editor, compiler, whatever your view is on the shape of the Tanakh. There it seems a little more always building to the same means, uses a lot of the same links back. But when it's used outside, the Jewish culture seems to hold on to that element as a static element, but not the whole Exodus. It seems a lot more pliable, perhaps just because it's a bigger pericope versus just that one little element. But I still find that interesting that they that difference and that pliability.
That's right.
Motif.
They disagree about what to do with it because they're all competing forms of Judaism, but they all agree what it is to start as a starting point.
That is very cool. Okay. Well, I'm going to have to dig into your doctoral work a little more and see how to carry forward.
I'm not trying to give you homework.
That's what I do for fun.
Okay.
I put in my earbuds, I put a book into this little reader I have, and it reads it to me. And
okay.
If there's Greek or Hebrew, I stop and I read it. Okay, whatever, and keep going. So.
Yeah, that's right. Mine is a mindless book. It'll be great for that. No, just kidding.
I'm sure.
Just kidding.
No, I'm sure I'll have to pause a few times and probably just read that one cover to cover with my eyes, which, I am excited to read that, though, because it's just, I'm reading a lot more on the Exodus motif as it stretches throughout the canon. As new works are being published all the time, it's become so popular in recent scholarship. And I think I've noticed that this is such a core element in Genesis. It was exciting and both surprising to see how core you see it as later in the canon, despite the fact that it was not as highlighted as you may expect if it's so core in the actual Exodus narrative.
Well, yeah, and I think that the fact that it's not highlighted is part of the proof that it is core.
Well, and something that you pointed out in your article that I found fascinating was, I missed this, that in, I think it's Exodus 4, God says that I'm going to get glory over Pharaoh to the nations, deliver you out. And there's a mention of bringing them out as a mixed multitude. You may have phrased that differently, I believe. I can't recall it exactly. But from the beginning expectations of the Exodus in the book of Exodus, you already have that element called out.
I'm trying to find the verse in Exodus 4. Yes, the answer is yes. That's there. God's game plan, right, is, I recently heard somebody describe pro football as the coaches are two chess players who are using different chess pieces, right? Huh. When the players are that in tune and that perfect in their performance, then it's different players that the coaches are deploying and they're playing chess with each other. And I think that God has the same sort of outlook starting in Exodus 3 or 4, the burning bush episode. He does have a game plan. So the thing that yes, I remember what you're talking about. It's in Exodus 3:19-ish and going forward from there. Where God says, here's how I'm going to pull you out. I'm going to pull you out with this, and this. And then in Exodus 12, the narrator says, and thereby God did pull them out with this, and this, and this. So the thing that God promises is his plan at the beginning of the Exodus narrative. He brings to fruition at that climactic moment of the Exodus in the Exodus narrative. And the narrator takes pains to kind of quote himself and republish the exact same bullet point list just to make sure that nobody misses, that they're hitting over the head. This is the thing that he said would happen 10 chapters earlier.
That is very cool. I just didn't realize how significant it is for the rest of the canon. That is, I love that, and I want to dig into it more. And so, just for the audience, next time you're reading through Revelation, pause on the fact that in Revelation 21, almost the very end of the book, you get this little mention of, and the city has no need of sun or moon to shine, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light, the nations walk, and the kings of the earth bring their glory into it. Its gates will never be shut by day. So is that one of the, I don't know, did you pick up on that occurrence in your work, or is that something a little different going on there?
No, that wasn't one of my database passages, but that is a
Well, you were
great
looking Old
candidate.
Testament, though, and
Yeah.
pre-Paul, right?
That's right. In the New Testament, I was restricted to Paul. I actually had somebody say, what about this passage from the Gospels? And then as the database would include, what about this passage from Revelation? It would be fantastic to say, yeah, the other New Testament writers did this too. But that's a great example of the kind of thing that other New Testament writers were thinking. They were thinking biblical theology thoughts and saying, yep, the Jesus version of Judaism and the Christ event is now putting this into action. And here we see it, poetically displayed in sort of this climactic concluding fashion.
And like you said, like John, he checks this box so we know, like, this is Yahweh working. This is his story. It's all the elements are here. So it's very cool. Well, yeah, thanks for staying on a few extra minutes to talk to me about this, because this is something that I'm trying to invest some energy into, and it's very helpful to me, and I think really just interesting to see, again, just how all these strands go throughout Scripture, and how it seems like the more you look at these typological recurrences of events, the Exodus is very often at the center of it.
Yeah. I'm glad if it is helpful at all. If any part that isn't, just throw it by the wayside. But if it is, great. And thanks for the invitation. I love to be able to take the time and do this.
Absolutely. Hopefully we'll get to talk to you again at some point about Ephesians.
Okay. That might be fun.
All right. Thanks for coming on.